Well, let me begin by thanking the Rajaratnam School of International Studies and in particular its Dean, Barry, for this invitation. In my intervention, I will discuss what I think is the key issue of our time, which is the proper governance of the House of Humanity. And my view is that this question of global governance cannot be dissociated from the deep changes in the global system of the recent past and the challenges of the near and not so near future. So let me start from there. Rapid look at the radical changes we've witnessed in recent decades. Two radical changes. The first is the rise of emerging countries, and the second is the growth in interdependencies. Last year marked the 20th consecutive year that exports of developing economies have grown faster than those of developed ones. The share of world trade of advanced economy fell from 75% in the 90s to roughly 50% today. Inflows of foreign direct investment in developing countries have increased from 20 to 50% in the last decade only. This shift in comparative advantage and economic weight that the world economy is facing today mirrors past experiences in the 19th, in the 20th century. But what is unique about the current transformation is the fast pace at which this change is taking place and the immense number of people involved. China's economy, for instance, was less than 2% of the world economy 20 years ago. Today, it accounts for roughly 10% in current dollar terms and is likely to more than double in the next 20 years. This rise of emerging countries was set in motion by the changes in technology, regulatory environment, transportation costs, and this swing in economic power has profound geopolitical consequences that will, in my view, hardly be reversible in the foreseeable future. Second big change in the past few decades is the dramatic increase in interdependencies. I use the plural because this growth of interdependency is not only an economic phenomenon, but it encompasses also relations in the social, environmental, technological sphere. In the economic domain, increased interdependency has certainly been a byproduct of the rise of trade and financial linkages. Globalization first denationalized consumption, allowing consumers to buy goods and services from places where they are produced more efficiently. More recently, we've also witnessed a new phenomenon of denationalization of production. The advent of new technologies and reduced trade costs now make it feasible to separate stages of production geographically, leading to the formation of value chains that span across borders. World trade in parts and components of manufactured goods as a rough measure of the importance of cross-border value chains has doubled between 2000 and 2010 in 10 years. The average import content of exports, which was 20% 20 years ago, is today 40%. But this economic evolution is hardly the only domain where interdependence across countries has increased. Migration, for instance, is the powerful vector of social interaction across diverse cultures. In the past 10 years, the total number of international migrants has increased by over 20%, reaching more than 200 million people worldwide. This means that migrants today would constitute the 5th most populous country in the world. With the advent of the information and communication technology revolution, technical, managerial know-how have now become more firm-specific and less nation-specific. This has led to an unprecedented surge in the international mobility of technical knowledge, the positive impact of which we may not still fully appreciate. But societies have also become more interdependent in risk-sharing in areas like health or the environment. Pollution, communication diseases clearly know no national boundary, and we saw that with SARS or with the H1N1. The shift in economic power from the West to the rest is also reshaping the geography of environmental degradation and gas, and specifically CO2 emission. So in light of these deep social, economic, technological changes, the policy and governance challenges that we face today are certainly more complex than they used to be. And we, in a way, are already reasonably familiar with the issues that our societies will have to confront in the decades to come. To summarize, as I see it, there are 5 broad areas where I believe action is needed. First, in the social domain, key challenges include population growth in the south and aging population in the north. Management of growing migratory flows, rapid rates of urbanization in developing countries, and the rising incidence of non-communicable and infectious diseases. Second area in the economic sphere, achieving a more sustainable, a more balanced economic growth, addressing the rising inequality and employment problems that endanger social inclusion in both developing and advancing countries, and managing this increasingly interdependent global system. Third, as history has taught us, environmental problems can lead to the collapse of civilizations. Climate change, biodiversity loss, food and water scarcity, energy security, the inevitably unequal distribution of resources will probably seriously test the peaceful coexistence, if not, in some cases, the existence of our societies. Fourth, welcome developments in democracy, in education, in human rights, but also more individualism, acquired rights, vested interests, have complicated the task of coalescing constituencies and made more difficult the task of managing change. In a way, the sense of belonging has been shrinking, is certainly more diverse. Free riding has become easier, and solidarity more elusive. And finally, science and technology can offer solutions to address many of the global challenges of our time, but they also bring new risks, such as the threats caused by nuclear proliferation, bioterrorism, cybercrime, as well as a complex array of ethical and legal questions, such as those associated to genetic research. Many of these issues are not new. Climate change, for instance, has been on the agenda since the 1972 United Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm. Disarmament negotiations have been dragging on for decades. So the key question then is why has so little political energy been spent to solve these critical and impending challenges of our future? A first answer comes from a question that Dante asked in his Divine Comedy, and I quote, "Now who art thou that on the bench would sit in judgment at 1,000 miles away, with the short vision of a single span?" Short-termism, as we would call today's Dante's concept, is first of all an anthropological problem. It acts as a huge brake to the exercise of leadership, but I believe it still is the role of a government to guide, to regulate, to educate, in a word, to correct the collective myopia that affects our societies. So this failure to act is, at least in part, a failure of our institutions. But short-termism is not the only cause of this regrettable inaction. Three other problems limit our collective ability to respond to these global challenges. First one is the political structure that we have inherited, this Westphalian order, based on the notion of full sovereignty of nation states. The inconsistency between the extent of interdependencies on the one hand and the fragmentation of the political structure on the other is often a cause of inefficient or lack of policy. The tragedy of this discord is that national governments find it individually rational to choose policies that, in the attempt to increase the welfare of their constituency, may actually reduce it. The temptation of protectionism is just one of the many examples of this self-destructive behavior. The second problem is what I would call a coherence gap. One often overlooked dimension of interdependency is the interdependency across issues. The increase in biofuel production to address energy security concerns was an important driver of the spike in food prices in 2008, because both biofuels and food competed for scarce land and water. Similarly, we know that climate change will have a huge impact on migratory flows. While the inability to address inequalities in developing countries will continue to affect global imbalances. So we need a more holistic view, but this often collides with the purely sectoral nature of our international institutions. The third problem is that while new economic and political trends have emerged, the rules, the institutions governing multilateral cooperation have not kept pace with these changes. And in fact, we are to a large extent living on the global stock of rules or institutions as it was created since the Second World War until the 90s, which is the last period of serious improvement in global governance. From climate change to trade negotiations, the difficulty in finding a new balance of rights and obligations between advanced countries on the one side and emerging countries on the other side in a muted context has certainly played a major role in holding back meaningful progress, which can only happen if countries accept to compromise with each other. So that leads me to my conclusion, which is, of course, to turn to the question of what should we do? If one looks at the reform of global governance from a practical perspective, what would be the essential principles that might allow us to move forward? And let me briefly point to 6 components. First, global actions require political will, clear projects, and common institutions. But these pillars can only be held together by a system of shared values, a sense of common purpose. Second principle, multilateralism, a system based on the centrality of a single economic or political hegemon, or some sort of directorate of 2 or 3 countries, is clearly now in contradiction with the emerging structure of economic power and the nature of these interdependencies. Third, public institutions can only be effective if they are articulated according to one basic principle, which is subsidiarity, which, by the way, is the ideological basement of federalism. Policy, decision-making power, should be allocated at the lowest level of government, national, regional, global, encompassing all benefits and costs. Fourth element is policy coherence. This means to ensure that international institutions do not function as vertical silos in isolation from each other. Fifth, commitments need to be enforceable. Global governance must be anchored in laws, regulations, but also in mechanisms for their enforcement, including binding dispute settlements. And finally, of course, legitimacy, which means finding ways to give citizens greater ownership of common institutions, greater say in their direction, And this also means that we need to foster a greater sense of solidarity by nurturing a sort of feeling of belonging, which takes us back to this issue of the necessity of a set of common values. This, in my view, can only be constructed bottom-up, starting from the local level, and hence the importance of an active civil society. I've been in the international area for some time now, and on this, I've changed my mind. 20 years ago, I was thinking global governance was about globalizing local problems. I think differently today. I think the main challenge of rooting global governance is about localizing global problems. So, shared values, multilateralism, subsidiarity, coherence, enforceability, legitimacy. Our task in the years to come is to reinvent a system of global governance which, my view is, should be based on these elements. Thank you for your attention.